Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, a few quick housekeeping notes. Please submit questions through the Q&A function at any time during the presentation. We'll hold questions until the end of the panel. We will also send slides, briefing materials, and other resources from our speakers after the webinar is over. With that, we'll get started. Thank you all for joining today's briefing, Carbon Capture, Existing Harms and Emerging Threats. My name is Jim Walsh with Food and Water Watch, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Carbon capture policy is moving quickly in Washington, D.C. Over the past several years, Congress has dramatically expanded federal subsidies for carbon capture, particularly through the 45Q tax credit. And at the same time, proposals are advancing for new carbon capture pipelines, expanded underground injection wells, and even offshore carbon storage. Many of these issues are surfacing in debates around reconciliation legislation, permitting reform, and broader infrastructure policy. But carbon capture is not a new concept. It already has a track record, and that record raises serious questions about taxpayer cost, public safety, environmental justice, and regulatory oversight. Today's panel will walk through several critical pieces of that picture: federal subsidies, pipeline infrastructure, injection well oversight, environmental justice impacts, and emerging proposals on offshore carbon storage. Our speakers today have been involved in efforts around carbon capture for quite a while. I'll do a quick introduction of them, and then we'll hear from our speakers. Annika June is an energy data analyst at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analyst, where she focuses on carbon capture and storage and fossil fuel hydrogen development. Her work uses data and spatial analysis to evaluate the financial and environmental impacts of emerging energy infrastructure. Basav Sen joined the Institute for Policy Studies as a climate justice project developer in 2017. His work focuses on resisting the continued build-out of the fossil fuel industry, for building climate solutions that address the demands of most impacted frontline communities. He's authored numerous research reports and articles on energy transportation justice and has frequently appeared an expert in print media, radio, and television. The Institute for Policy Studies is also a member of the Climate Justice Alliance. Paul Blackburn is an attorney advisor for the Bold Alliance, attorney and policy advisor for the Bold Alliance. He provides legal and policy expertise on pipeline safety and energy infrastructure, and he's worked on oil and carbon dioxide pipeline issues for more than a decade, including regulatory proceedings, policy analysis related to major projects like Keystone XL and Enbridge pipelines. Pam Richard is co-director of the Eco-Justice Collaborative in Illinois, and a leader in efforts to strengthen oversight of the carbon capture and carbon dioxide pipelines. She's helped lead the successful campaign to stop multiple carbon dioxide proposals in the Midwest and played a key role in developing Illinois' Safe CCS Act and protections for the Mahomet Aquifer. Our goal is to provide a clear overview of the issues policymakers should be paying attention to as carbon capture policies move forward. With that, let's turn to Annika June from IEFA, who will talk about the 45Q tax credit, a massive federal subsidy that's underwriting the carbon capture industry. Annika, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks. Could you go to my first slide, please? Perfect. Hi, it's good to be here today. Annika June with the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or IEFA. Today I'll be talking about 45Q. It's a key federal tax credit that's driving the growth of projects related to CCUS, and it could represent hundreds of billions in lost taxpayer dollars, despite the lack of evidence that the projects can deliver any reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. A key feature of 45Q is that it does not actually have explicit goals related to emissions reductions. And in fact, projects do not result in emissions benefits when you consider the entire production life cycle. As a tax credit, there's no transparency regarding companies' claims for 45Q. The EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program provided some information to the public regarding companies' claims of CO2 captured and stored or used. However, the elimination of that program means that there will be even less information available to the public or even the IRS, which will make it difficult to validate companies' claims. Finally, the credit is uncapped, either for claimants or for the credit in total. Because the credit is extremely lucrative, companies are lining up to access it. We've not seen large-scale costs to date, as these massive projects can take 5 to 10 years to progress from announcement to operationally capturing CO2. But hundreds of projects have been announced or are in the development pipeline. And even if a fraction of those move forward, taxpayers will be on the hook for billions of dollars. Next slide. Briefly, there are a few features of 45Q that are worth noting. It's a tax credit available to companies that capture CO2 that is subsequently stored permanently underground or utilized for other purposes. For every metric ton of CO2 captured at an industrial or power plant or gas processing facility, the credit value is $85 if stored or used. For direct air capture, the credit value is $180 per ton. Accepted uses include forcing more oil and gas out of the ground through enhanced oil or gas recovery, EOR or EGR. 45Q credits can be claimed by the company capturing CO2. Other companies in the carbon management value chain would then be paid for services such as transport and disposal. There's no independent audit of CO2 captured and stored or used. Companies essentially report and document their own figures with verification provided by third parties they hire. The recent safe harbor provision for 45Q that was passed in December made this option available to companies claiming credit for sequestered CO2. Previously, those figures were reported to IRS as well as to EPA through the GHGRP. The credit can be claimed for 12 years, and companies can sell excess credits, effectively creating a new revenue stream. There's no cap on the amount of credit that can be claimed by a single company or accessed through 45Q as a whole. When the rule was first created, there was a limit to the amount of captured CO2 that could qualify, but that limit was removed. Next slide. Nearly $1 billion have been spent between 2005 and 2024 in lobbying efforts supporting CCUS. This is according to a 2025 peer-reviewed analysis from researchers at MIT. This chart from their paper shows how much of that money was spent by core fossil fuel and fossil fuel adjacent companies. Their expenditures account for nearly 90% of the lobbying money spent. This analysis reflects the intense appetite the fossil fuel industry has for CCUS, especially 45Q and opportunities for its expansion. Next slide. There are a lot of problems with 45Q. Chief among them is that it is a tax rule and cannot substitute for proper environmental regulation. This is problematic in two ways. First, there is no provision in law that allows IRS and EPA to communicate directly. EPA cannot share information directly with IRS, even if there's an incident report submitted to EPA that might include essential information about, say, CO2 leakage or loss of containment that could impact credit amounts or justify a clawback of an allowed credit. Second, claims do not require the demonstration of any emissions reductions, net or otherwise. The overall significance of establishing the credit in the first place is really brought into question here. We're talking about potentially hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars with no mechanism to determine whether or not there is a climate benefit. 45Q has been around since 2008, so there has been an opportunity to see how the credit has been administered, and the news isn't good. In 2020, TIGTA, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, reported lack of compliance with EPA regulations by claimants. A subsequent study released in 2023 by Taxpayers for Common Sense found $894 million of the $1 billion claimed in 45Q credits between 2010 and 2019 did not actually meet the EPA requirements for reporting. And these findings indicate that the IRS is not well equipped to evaluate credit claims and ensure they meet the standards imposed by the regulatory agency. And as a tax rule, again, there's simply no transparency related to the claims. Finally, it's unclear what the total cost to taxpayers will actually be for 45Q. A recent estimate from the Department of Treasury found the total cost would be about $43 billion. That's a lot of money, but it seems really low when a single project could access $6 billion over 12 years of eligibility. IEFA released some estimates last year that found the total cost of announced projects could be more than $800 billion. And while it's true that not all of those projects will end up being built, the price tag for the credit is really an unknown. Next slide. To illustrate just how much is at stake, this is just information for a single proposed hydrogen/ammonia project in Louisiana. That this one project could access a total of $6.3 billion in 45Q credits over 12 years. That's nearly as much as the $8 billion price tag that there is to construct the entire facility. But here's the kicker. Even if the carbon capture rate at the facility is just 60%, which is well below the 95% promised, and well below a threshold of net GHG emission reductions, the company would still qualify for $4 billion over 12 years. This is just one project out of hundreds of CCS-dependent projects announced or in the development pipeline that could qualify for 45Q. I'll end my comments here and look forward to answering questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. Your overview really highlights a key point for me, and that is that carbon capture is not just a technology debate, it's a major federal spending issue. And the 45Q tax credit has become one of the largest subsidies supporting fossil fuel infrastructure in the country. And as Annika described, it's also faced longstanding concerns about fraud and government oversight. And those subsidies are, quite frankly, what is helping finance the build out of carbon dioxide pipelines and injection wells, which brings us to our next issue, how the infrastructure operates on the ground and what risks it poses to communities. And for that, I will turn it over to Paul Blackburn from the Bold Alliance, who's going to discuss the core purpose and political consequences of the carbon capture industry. Thank you, Paul.
Hey, thanks, Jim. And thanks everybody for being here today. Let's move right into this and go to the next slide. So Annika talked about some of the problems with 45Q, but let's talk about why it exists. Because there's a lot of belief that this was for climate mitigation. And I think, when you saw the slide that Annika put up about who funded the lobbying for the 45Q program, realize that the fossil fuel industry spent almost $1 billion over 20 years to get the 45Q tax credit and CCS going. They don't do that without an expectation of return on investment, right? Another indication of this is that it's really for enhanced oil recovery using carbon dioxide, is that the 45Q tax credit is one of the few IRA, Inflation Reduction Act tax credit to survive the Trump administration's acts of it in the better. And it's the only one that was increased. It was increased substantially from $60 per metric ton to $85 per metric ton. The Trump administration didn't keep the 45Q tax credit around because it's good for the climate. It kept it around because frankly, the fossil fuel industry and specifically the oil industry wants it. One of the things you need to realize is that the fracking is dropping in all the basins except for the Permian Basin, and in the oil industry, including all the oil field development companies, need to have business going in the future. And they seem to believe that the EOR, enhanced oil recovery, is the way to go with CO2. And that's where they're shooting for. That's why they put so much effort into this tax credit. And why are they using CO2? Well, if you're going to do enhanced oil recovery, you need a very large amount of material to pump it underground. And CO2 is the only substance potentially available in large enough quantities to allow widespread use of enhanced oil recovery. Yes, there are other substances that can be used, but not in the millions and millions of, tens of millions of tons that are required to get a large amount of oil on the ground. Next slide, please. And it is a massive subsidy. At $85 per metric ton, you get roughly about 2 barrels of oil out of each metric ton you put in the ground. And at that rate, that's roughly they get $40 of federal taxpayer money for each barrel of oil they bring out of the ground. Now, right now, oil prices are very high at around $100 a barrel because of the Mideast war. But $40 per barrel is still a truly massive and unprecedented subsidy for the U.S. oil industry. This is not free market oil. Enhanced CO2 EOR has been around since the 1970s. And it hasn't gone anywhere because it's just too expensive. But when you put in $40 roughly per barrel of oil brought out of the ground, that's just a remarkably huge federal taxpayer subsidy. And let's move on to the next. And then the other thing is, well, those numbers there show you. This is a recent study just came out a couple of days ago from Veris, a consultant for the oil industry. And they said now with a 45Q tax credit, their break-even price for oil is $16 per barrel. That means that oil prices could drop to $16 per barrel, and that's when they'd start losing money. And that's, significantly cheaper than fracking is even seen as being now. Again, they're just pumping so much federal tax dollars into this subsidy. It's just truly a remarkable amount of money. Next slide. So what are the political consequences of this? Well, what we've seen with pipeline development in the United States is there's this broad, aggressive, and very successful bipartisan community opposition to CO2 pipelines and sequestration sites. And they're concerned about pipeline safety, wasted tax dollars and oligarch subsidies, climate change fraud, both from the conservative greenwashing side and the left greenwashing side of the conservatives who think climate change in total is a fraud, and they're concerned about water use. So next slide. So pipeline safety. First off, when CO2 pipelines rupture, it's super critical, essentially like a liquid CO2. It expands approximately 500 times in volume explosively and can blanket in very large areas with carbon dioxide, which will suffocate people if the concentrations get too high. Even if the concentrations are lower, it can intoxicate people, have toxic effects, do brain damage. The big rupture that happened a few years ago in Satartia, the people there were described as, because of the intoxicating effects of the CO2, as walking around like zombies. The existing federal regulations are widely perceived as being inadequate. They essentially took the oil pipeline regulations and added the words "and carbon dioxide" at the end of a bunch of different places in the regulations, and they just were never designed for carbon dioxide pipelines. And there's many reasons why they just don't work very well. The Trump and Biden administration put out some draft regs. Trump administration terminated those, so we're with no significant federal action to try to improve carbon dioxide pipelines, and landowners are very well aware of that. And because of that, and because of a lot of things that the pipeline industry says, like carbon dioxide is no more dangerous than the fizz in your pop and things like that, across the country, people who are facing these pipelines just don't trust either PHMSA or the pipeline industry. They've been lied to so many times and misled that they really are quite hostile to both PHMSA and the pipeline industry. Also, the federal government preempts a lot of very important things that local governments want to do, like consider safety and routing. So we'll go to the next slide, please. And this is widely seen as an oligarch subsidy. Now, there's the climate change issue where conservatives don't like that, but even in the industry messages that climate change is not one of the issues that they're doing these pipelines for, but instead for its enhanced oil recovery, landowners still see this as an oligarch ripoff subsidy, and they really don't want it. We're seeing massive opposition in Louisiana to these pipelines, for example. Let's go to the next slide. And I can't go into all the things here, but for example, in South Dakota, in a primary election a couple years ago, after the state legislature passed a law that landowners considered to be bad, they unelected 12 of 14 Republicans in their primaries. And it's very rare to have a single issue take out even a single candidate. But here, having 12 out of 14 taken out, they replaced the Republican Party chair. They passed a ballot initiative to wipe out the bad legislation, and they passed legislation to ban the use of eminent domain for carbon dioxide pipelines. We've got litigation going. We've got other states are planning to ban the use of eminent domain, like Iowa. There's legislative effort in Illinois, in Nebraska. We've got scores of county pipeline ordinances passed. And remember, these are all mostly red areas. So we've got projects that have been terminated, like Navigator. The Summit project has been severely hobbled. And there's opposition everywhere. People really see through this tax credit as a scam. Next slide, please. And thank you for your time today. And I think we'll pass it on to the next person.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think one of the real important takeaways from Paul's remarks is that carbon capture is not being used to reduce emissions. It's being used to produce more oil through enhanced oil recovery. And we're seeing proposals for new carbon dioxide pipeline networks across multiple states. And we know that carbon dioxide pipeline ruptures pose serious risks to nearby communities. And pipelines, though, are really only part of the carbon capture system and part of the danger. The carbon capture dioxide ultimately needs to be injected underground, which raises another set of regulatory and safety issues. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Pam Richart from the Eco Justice Collaborative. Pam, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. And I echo what everyone has said. Thank you for taking the time to be here to learn about this important issue. I'm from Illinois, where ADM indicators well leaked. What have we learned? We learned that they do, in fact, leak. And in Illinois, at the Decatur site, the wells leaked twice. These were monitoring wells and they weren't injection wells, but they were constructed of the same material that the injection wells are currently. So what happened? ADM used a multi-level well that allowed sampling both below and above the cap rock, but the steel corroded. The sampling sleeves wouldn't close, and allowing CO2 and brine to move from the injection zone below the cap through the well and then above the cap into an unauthorized area. The steel that was used was never tested in the corrosive CO2 brine environment that exists in the injection zone. And in October of 2023, after trying to repair their well, ADM plugged it, but they continued to inject CO2 with only one of their required wells. Next slide. So the EPA receives regular reports from ADM, as they do other companies, and they knew about the failure that began in January of 2022. Yet they did nothing until June of 2024. The agency should have issued a notice of violation when they first learned ADM's well was not sampling in all of the required zones. But most definitely, after ADM plugged one of the two required wells, they should have issued a notice of violation. And they should have required ADM to stop injecting CO2 consistent with permit requirements, but they did not. ADM did voluntarily stop injecting CO2 when they learned that their second monitoring well was leaking brine. Next slide. But there were public failures as well. Neither ADM nor the EPA notified the public of the leak. They simply said we aren't required to, and so we didn't. This meant that Illinois' CCS regulatory bill was negotiated, passed, and signed while the well was leaking, and that bill exempts ADM's existing operations in Decatur. But ADM never said a word during those negotiations. And during this time, ADM was also negotiating an easement with Decatur City Council to store CO2 under Lake Decatur, their source of drinking water for about 70,000 people. Would this easement have been approved if the City Council and the public knew the well had leaked? Likely not. And residents in that area are organizing and are getting a lot of press and media attention as they pressure the city council to revoke the agreement with ADM because they have concerns about water contamination. Next slide. This past summer, ADM did restart their project after they rebuilt their wells. And after the leak, the EPA did recommend the use of 25 chrome steel for wells versus a 13 chrome that leaked and corroded. While thought to be more corrosion resistant, 25 chrome steel has never been tested either, raising a lot of concerns about the integrity of injection wells. Next slide. Last fall, the EPA issued a draft Class 6 well permit to Marquis Energy in Illinois. But the EPA dismissed the concerns that we raised relative to impacts from CO2 injection on an existing hazardous injection well that has dumped a lot of sulfuric acid and hydrochloric acid down the well over time in the same zone where the CO2 would be stored. The two plumes, as you can see from the graphic, they overlap, but they are at different elevations. If they intersect due to increased pressure from CO2 injection, the resulting toxic soup would corrode both wells and release contaminants into drinking water. The EPA also ignored the fact that a prominent geologist had determined that a fault that runs through the area of review, that yellow line that looks like a circle on the outer edge of the slide, um, uh, that geologist had determined a fault runs through there and it's likely reactivated, raising concerns, at least to us, about triggered seismicity. All of this is my way of saying our experience with the EPA here in Illinois is anything but stellar. Next slide, please. Not surprisingly, residents are angry and they are upset. They raised these concerns at the EPA open house. I was there too, and the EPA simply said, "No problem, you're wrong." And they, like others affected by CCS in Illinois, have formed an organization to express their opposition and concerns to the press, their county board, and adjacent counties that are located within the AOR. Now, of some help here, the Illinois EPA also weighed in and raised the same concerns about the CO2 injection well and pressure on the hazardous waste well. And so did an expert that we hired to review the permit. So we aren't raising concerns that weren't valid. Next slide, please. This is the tracker the EPA uses to let the public know what's happening with respect to Class 6 well permits in terms of timing, and it also tracks the number of projects and wells currently under their review. You may know that their review takes typically a good 2.5 to 3 years, sometimes longer. Next slide. But the Trump administration's cuts in EPA staffing are raising key concerns here in Illinois and across the country over the agency's ability to process these permits and conduct thorough reviews. Next slide. To meet the growing demand for permit review, both the EPA and industry have been pushing for Class 6 primacy. And you can see here that the number of applications by states to the EPA to take over the Class 6 program is astounding. Why is this a problem? Well, some of us are concerned that state primacy could actually weaken reviews and threaten drinking water through things like inconsistent, less stringent regulations, bypassing community input, prioritizing industry speed. Next slide, please. This slide is to show you that the concerns don't stop with Class 6 well injection, but they include the thousands of Class 2 injection wells that exist across the country that are used for extracting oil. And injecting CO2 into Class 2 wells carries many of the same risks associated with Class 6 and has an even higher percentage, a documented higher percentage of mechanical well failure. But regulation for Class 2 wells are even less stringent, posing a greater risk of leaks. This slide happens to show a blowout at a Class 2 well that lasted for over 2 weeks, and millions of gallons of brine were released, contaminating the surrounding ranch land. Last slide, please. So to respond to this crisis, Representatives Sean Casten and Jared Huffman have asked for a moratorium on Class 6 and Class 2 injection wells until the EPA can ensure that, one, CO2 is not leaking from wells, two, mechanical and operational integrity can protect drinking water, and three, staffing is adequate to provide oversight. And we hope to get others to support this proposal. Thank you, and I too look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Pam. Pam's remarks highlight a major issue in the current policy debate: oversight. It's weak, it lacks necessary safeguards, and it's absent of any real accountability. And there's currently this push to transfer more oversight authority from EPA to states, as Pam pointed out, causes serious concerns with the ability to have any sort of consistency with enforcement, which also causes significant challenges for the enforcement of tax credits. But expanding these programs without addressing existing oversight challenges is just going to create more risks. And this is a critical dimension that the carbon capture debate and who bears the impacts of this infrastructure and those risks. And for this, we're going to turn to Basaf Sen from the Institute for Policy Studies. Basaf, thanks for being here today.
Hi, Jim, my video is disabled. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar. I'm going to talk about the environmental justice impact, the human and community impact of carbon capture. Next slide, please. So CCS is a hazard and injustice multiplier. It creates new environmental risks, and we heard about some of them from Paul and Pam, CO2 pipeline ruptures, injection well blowouts, and groundwater contamination. But it's also important to note that CCS actually exacerbates existing environmental risks at the point of production and the point of combustion of fossil fuels. And the exposure to all of these risks is highly unequal. Some communities disproportionately bear these risks. Next slide, please. So injection wells in particular pose a threat to water-stressed communities. So we heard about the CO2 leakage from injection wells to aquifers. This can lead to groundwater acidification and trace metal contamination because acidified groundwater can react with surrounding rocks to leach trace metals such as cadmium and strontium, all of which are toxic into groundwater. And communities in drought-prone regions and communities who are dependent on well water, who are not connected to pipe water, are most threatened by the injection well contamination of groundwater. Next slide, please. This is a map showing a 25-year average of drought in the US, and note that water-scarce regions have a large overlap with regions with high oil and gas production, like in Texas and Oklahoma. And these are the very communities where there are people who are dependent on groundwater and where a lot of this injection is happening and going to happen. And in the next slide, please, we're going to look at who this disproportionately impacts. So a stunning 48% of tribal households are not connected to sanitation, and 15% of US households rely on well water, and 18% have no connection to sewage treatment. And it is these households, disproportionately rural, disproportionately indigenous, and lower income, who bear the brunt of impacts of contaminated groundwater that could arise from CO2 injection. Next slide, please. So, like I noted earlier, CCS does not merely create these new hazards like CO2 pipelines and injection wells. It also exacerbates well-known existing environmental hazards. And to understand why, we must look at what's called the energy penalty of CCS. CCS systems take a lot of energy to operate. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's between 13 and 44% more energy, which means you'd be burning somewhere between 13 to 44% more fossil fuels at facilities with CCS than at facilities without. So where does this excess fossil fuel come from? It comes from more oil and gas drilling and coal mining, which would mean more water contamination from coal mine tailings and from fracking wastewater, etc. More air pollution, again, from coal dust and from volatile organic compounds from oil drilling operations. And all of these disproportionately harm frontline communities who are already overexposed to fossil fuel pollution. And then at the combustion end, you'd be burning, again, 13 to 44% more fossil fuels. And so you'll get more fine particulate matter, more nitrogen oxides, and more other pollutants, mercury, various volatile organic compounds, etc. And these polluting power plant and industrial facilities, which are being and will be fitted with CCS, also disproportionately burden frontline communities because that's where they are located. Next slide, please. And finally, we come to the subject of enhanced oil recovery, which we heard about from all of our previous speakers. This is enabling, again, more fossil fuel production and use, which will continue to exacerbate those same environmental justice problems of impacts of fracking and drilling and coal mining and impacts of burning those fossil fuels. And this is being subsidized at a staggering scale, like we heard about from Annika. So we see here that the pre-IRA levels were pretty low, $50 per ton for point source capture with geological storage and for direct air capture, and 35 for point source capture with enhanced oil recovery. The IRA increased those levels, and then the 2025 budget bill equalized the tax credit for enhanced oil recovery and for point source capture with long-term geological storage. And so we are literally subsidizing environmental injustice through this. And I do want to talk briefly about the direct air capture issue as well. Direct air capture, as you see from this chart, is very heavily subsidized to the tune of $180 per ton of CO2 captured. And this sounds like a huge subsidy, but remember that direct air capture is inordinately expensive. The direct air capture operators will have every incentive to sell the CO2 that they capture for even more enhanced oil recovery. So even the direct air capture subsidy is incentivizing more environmental injustice. And that's all for today. And I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basav. Your remarks remind us these projects affect real communities and communities across the country that are already overburdened with the impacts of fossil fuels, the pipelines, the capture facilities, the storage sites, and the whole fossil fuel chain that is supporting this industry is just concentrating industrial activity and risk in communities. And these are the ones who are already facing significant environmental and health burdens. I want to thank our speakers for speaking to these issues, but I also want to flag one other thing before we get into the Q&A. And that is the fact that the administration is planning on moving forward with rules later this year that would actually expand carbon dioxide injections to offshore under the outer continental shelf. We have heard about all the issues and challenges that we're having with actually safely transporting and injecting carbon dioxide into the earth. Those problems will only be harder to enforce and to protect if we start moving these projects into offshore CO2 injections. Can you imagine the BP Horizon disaster coming together with what we saw happen in Illinois? And how we know there that there was a leak that was happening for years, and in the putting that leak underground would be even harder to fulfill or to actually repair and protect communities, our climate and coastal ecosystems for. There's also pushes by the industry to pair this carbon dioxide equipment with liquefied natural gas facilities. This creates new risks that could potentially happen, where we've seen recent ruptures and explosions at incidents at natural gas facilities, liquefied natural gas facilities in the Gulf, that would be compounded by the co-location of carbon dioxide capture equipment. And what this whole discussion makes clear is that carbon capture policy is something that Congress is, whether you want to address it or not, it's being addressed. And the administration is pushing it forward. There are subsidies that are currently happening. There are pipelines currently being built and proposed around the country. There is expansion of injection wells. There's growing environmental justice concerns. And these offshore storage proposals make things worse. And we're concerned that there will be proposals that will move through potential reconciliation proposals that are being talked about, broader infrastructure and permitting debates that are being discussed. And all of these could potentially significantly accelerate carbon capture development. We know that pipeline safety rules are potentially may move to the floor this year, either by themselves or part of a larger package. And these all give opportunities for members of Congress to weigh in and take steps to protect communities from this infrastructure, but also to speak out against the further expansion of this industry, to rein in this dangerous and harmful and unnecessary practice that is largely being used to fund and put forward more oil and gas development. And with that, I'm going to turn now to our speakers, and I'll invite you to all come on camera. And we received a number of questions in advance from this, but if people have additional questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And, first, I would like to go to Annika, and I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about offshore CO2 injections, and can you talk a little bit about what information you have about the extent of those leases and their locations, and what we might be expecting from offshore CO2 injections if they were to take place?
Absolutely. Yeah, happy to talk about that. Haley, if you could bring up that slide that I've got showing the offshore lease maps, that would be great to illustrate this point a little bit. Jim, you talked about this upcoming opportunity to start thinking about the draft rule that is going to be released by BOEM and BSEE later this year. I believe it's supposed to come out in May. So the issue is that there were supposed to be regulations for CCS activities in the offshore within 12 months of the passage of the IIJA in 2021, and that has not happened. But industry was really paying attention to that. Industry is really interested in CCS projects offshore. One of the big problems that Paul discussed was that putting in pipelines through private land owner space, having large area of reference zones that Pam referred to, you're involving a lot of private landowners. And the more landowners you have, the more opportunity you have to, there's going to be more opposition. But in the offshore, that's not the case. So what this map is showing you is it's showing you some lease holdings that are currently held primarily by Exxon, that's the shades of orange, and Repsol, and a consortium of other project owners that are connected in these projects. But it's the Repsol-led projects in purple, Exxon-led in orange, and then the tiny blue one is Chevron. And so the darker shades are showing holdings that are in Texas state waters. So those are currently permitted for CCS activities. The ones that are not currently permitted for any kind of CCS activities are those lighter shades of orange and purple. Those are in the OCS. So whatever rules and regulations are passed by BOEM and BSEE will impact those holdings. And I just want to, it's hard to get a scale, an idea of really how big these lease holdings are in the Gulf. Altogether, those purple and orange areas are about the area of Delaware. These are massive holdings. This is a huge amount of territory. And industry is extremely interested in pushing this CO2 storage offshore. The orange area alone, that's in the vicinity of the Houston Ship Channel, and Exxon is developing a plan there to inject up to 100 million metric tons of CO2 per year by 2040. That's not that far away. It's a massive amount of CO2 storage when we look at the ADM well, which, on a good year, maybe had 0.7 million metric tons of injection in a year. So we're talking massive projects. We're talking about pushing this activity offshore, and industry is very interested in getting these rules passed, and will be likely aggressively involved in getting them to be very favorable. So I'm glad that we had this chance to sort of bring up this issue, since it's going to be one that's going to be coming down the pike very quickly.
Thank you so much, Annika. We will be sure to put together a more expansive briefing looking specifically at that issue of offshore CO2 injections. And I also want to highlight for the people watching this webinar today that the Outer Continental Shelf also extends along the eastern and western coast of the United States. And within that, there's vast areas of injections that could happen outside of the Gulf. And and actually, just as an aside, one of the first carbon capture project that I helped to stop was in 2009 in New Jersey. There was a proposal to actually capture CO2 at a fertilizer facility and inject out of the Outer Continental Shelf. And due to tremendous grassroots opposition and outreach on that project was put to a halt. And so it's a very important issue for everyone across the country, but particularly those of us in coastal states that could have significant impacts on our shorelines as well as local economies. So thanks for bringing that up, Annika. I appreciate it. Next, Paul, I'd like to ask you a question. One of the things that we hear a lot about from the industry is that this claim of carbon neutral oil or CO2 extraction using oil would result in lower carbon dioxide emissions and net emissions. Can you speak to that and like the validity of those claims?
Sure. Well, the problem with those claims is that in order for get the oil, get oil out of the ground, you have to inject the CO2 into the ground. And excuse me, my mind just went blank. What was the question again, Jim?
EOR, enhanced oil recovery. The industry's claiming that CO2 is being used to actually reduce net emissions of carbon dioxide, right? And this is like carbon neutral oil drilling.
Yeah. So here's the thing. There aren't any other substitutes for CO2 in large quantities. Yes, there are alkalines and synthetic chemicals. Heat can be used to get this oil out of the ground, this trapped oil out of the ground, but that's all extraordinarily expensive. And there's other substances too. But when you're doing enhanced oil recovery, you need to have a large amount of material that you can just afford to leave underground. And when you're looking at the plans for enhanced oil recovery around the country, we're not talking about millions of barrels or millions of gallons of solvents. You're talking about hundreds of millions of barrels of solvents to make this industry work at scale. And the only thing that's available for that is CO2 and potentially in large amounts. And that requires captured CO2, anthropogenic CO2. So, if there was no 45Q tax credit, this industry wouldn't grow to any significant degree. And CO2 enhanced oil recovery has been around since the 1970s. It's only provided about 2 or 3% of US production because it's just too expensive. Without the 45Q tax credit, there would not be sufficient CO2 for this industry to work. It would not be affordable. And this oil would just simply stay in the ground because it wouldn't be able to get out with other measures. that claim only applies if it could be gotten out some other way, but really CO2 EOR is the only option for it. So if we don't have 45Q, we don't get the soil on the ground, it stays safely underground, and we just simply don't get it. But we also don't have massive federal deficits to pay for this massive subsidy for the oil industry.
Thank you, Paul. I think this really just highlights, for me, anyways, just how over the years the oil and gas industry has done so much to mislead the public and policymakers about what they're doing and the impacts of their activities. And this is just another chapter in that story. Thank you so much. Basaf, I have a question for you. When policymakers hear concerns from communities about the carbon capture projects, what are the most common issues residents are raising?
So it's some of the familiar ones we heard about, concerns about injection wells contaminating their groundwater, concerns about CO2 pipelines exploding and the resulting fatalities potentially. And also in some cases, and I'll flag a particular example for you, where there are communities adjacent to historic polluting facilities such as coal-fired power plants. And the communities have been polluted for years and they want that plant to be closed down. But instead, plants are being kept open, given a fresh lease of life by saying that, oh, now we are going to do CCS, we'll capture the emissions, and so CO2 emissions are not a concern anymore, and we'll keep the facility open. And this has actually happened, for example, with the San Juan power generating station in New Mexico, which was slated to be closed and is now still open with proposal for adding CCS. So sometimes it is concerns about a facility that the adjacent community wants to actually close down, but it's kept open because of CCS.
Thank you, Basaf. It makes me also think about a connection that we're seeing in other facilities where we're seeing expansion in ethanol production. Where, is also a large polluting industry, in rural communities that are, and that this is a huge subsidy to that industry. At the same time, now there's actually talk going on Capitol Hill to expand subsidies for the ethanol industry. And, it's really a way that we're just hardening in these dirty fuels that are causing more pollution for communities and driving up costs for consumers. And I appreciate your work and thanks for being here today. Pam, Illinois has become a major focus for carbon storage projects, and a lot because of your work raising concerns about them in Illinois. Do you have lessons from what's happening in Illinois that that Congress should be paying attention to as carbon capture infrastructure is accelerating across the country?
Yes, thanks for the question, Jim. I think I do. I would say over the past, oh, good heavens, 3, 4 years, we've seen this major push for CCS development in Illinois that has now gotten us to a position that if they're all approved, we're going to have nearly 500 tons, million metric tons stored here in Illinois. Everybody thinks it's about jobs. Everybody thinks it's about economic development, right? And what we did when we saw all of these projects coming forward, the environmental community got together to draft and pass a regulatory bill that does now require a state permit for carbon capture, CO2 pipelines, and carbon sequestration. And since we're talking about storage here, I'll focus on that. The federal government could do some of what we did because our bill goes beyond Class 6 regulations. We prohibit enhanced oil recovery. I know some of the folks on this team have been talking about that, did today, and for the reasons that it is not a climate solution. You can't do it here in Illinois, the end. Don't even try. It's banned. We also prohibited a developer from turning a project over to the state. I know we're talking about primacy today, but Illinois didn't want primacy, and Illinois doesn't want the responsibility of a project that could fail sometime in the future. So we mandate operators provide proof of insurance and financial capability for long-term care. And we've also established a long-term trust fund to pay for administration and emergency response. We also have taken care of, at least in part, what we're seeing happen with newly approved projects across the country, where the default post-closure care period should be 50 years, but they're coming in with a 12-year post-closure care period. Our bill says 30 years minimum. And by the way, that 12 years, I think we can tie back to the 45Q tax credit, because that's the length of time industry would be receiving funds for that. Just a few more things. We require soil and air gas monitoring that allows earlier detection. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, we say if you're coming here and you contaminate our water, you have to replace it. And you also have to provide medical monitoring for people affected by a CO2 leak. And while this isn't perfect, it does show that I think as we look to the impacts of CO2 injection wells on people and their health and their water, there's a whole lot more we could be doing at the federal level that I think people could look at that Illinois is doing. That's just a sample. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pam. And yeah, it's really amazing that they come in with this 12-year timeline, which mirrors the tax credit. Really super concerning and shows what they're in it for. And even a 30-year timeline still doesn't get to the root of like how long that CO2 needs to be sequestered for, which is forever. And we know that concrete leaks, the earth moves, and keeping that sequestered forever is probably a pipe dream that will never come to fruition. But it'll be the taxpayers of Illinois and elsewhere who are left holding the bag for all of that, unfortunately. Annika, you spoke a little bit about the safe harbor rule that passed to make it easier for companies to access 45Q in absence of the EPA greenhouse gas reporting program. And, this rule would, require third-party verification. We've been very critical of the IRS and EPA's oversight of injection wells and things like that. Do you see this as an improvement over previous requirements or a step backwards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, third-party verification, it sure sounds like, there's some oversight. It sure sounds like that is an improvement over companies providing some sort of self-report, but really it's just another version of self-report. These third-party verifiers are people or companies that are hired by the entities that are seeking these credits. So it doesn't really provide any sort of independent certification or verification. It's really checking some documents and saying, yeah, this looks reasonable. So no, I don't think it's an improvement in terms of actually verifying what is being captured, where it is being sent, whether it's going for EOR, whether it's going for storage. I think it's actually making the situation worse because without any separate reporting to, say, EPA, it makes it much more difficult for the public to even know what is happening, how much CO2 is being captured, whether it's being stored permanently, whether it's going to EOR. It's just another way to obscure what industry is actually doing. So no, I absolutely don't see any benefit to the safe harbor ruling.
Thank you, Annika. And yeah, the transparency that you raised there too is just outstanding when we think about the fact that the congressional staff who are listening to this call and their bosses aren't even able to see the documents justifying this because they're all submitted with tax forms, which make them secret. And, this is a multi-billion-dollar program potentially spilling into the hundreds of billions of dollars. And taxpayers have no ability to even understand the basics that are used to justify why that tax credit is handed over. It's really a disgusting use of resources. When we think about so many better ways that public resources can be used other than funneling them to oil and gas and just interest for a secret subsidy. Paul, if you can come back on, I have a question for you about pipeline safety. And, we know that Congress is in the process of considering pipeline safety rules, and with the new pipeline networks that are being proposed around the country, what do you say, would you say are the biggest safety and regulatory gaps Congress should be aware of and address in pipeline safety rules?
Probably the biggest one is that what communities are concerned about the most is the potential for fatality areas and injury areas around these pipelines. There are modeling ways to figure out where the CO2 from these ruptures might go. And if you're too close to a ruptured pipeline, you will die. Everybody in that area will die. The CO2 concentrations will be so high that it'll just smother everybody relatively quickly. And if you're out a little bit further from there, the chances are you're going to be injured and potentially quite seriously. There are models that can determine what these danger zones are. And the industry generally doesn't like to do the best modeling. And so we don't really know what the danger zones are around these pipelines. Now, there was a study being done by PHMSA, Texas A&M, to investigate what these areas should be using computer modeling. It was almost done, and the Trump administration's PHMSA killed the study and kept all of its initial results secret. So that's probably one of the biggest gaps in pipeline safety issues. But there are many others: contaminants, steel standards, the valve locations, whether there should be getting odorants in the pipeline so people can tell if CO2 is leaking. There's lots of different needs for this. And again, the Biden administration had developed regulations to address not all the issues concerned about, but many of them, and those draft regulations were withdrawn by the Trump administration. And landowners get that, and they see the federal government is simply not really being concerned about their lives and well-being.
Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah, and when you think about the fact that there's, as many as 90,000 miles the Department of Energy thinks may be built for carbon capture infrastructure. This is through urban and rural and suburban communities near hospitals and schools. These questions of carbon dioxide pipeline safety become all the more important. Basaf, you discussed environmental justice impacts of carbon capture infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit about the patterns you're seeing in terms of where these projects are being proposed and which communities are most affected?
Unsurprisingly, it's areas with high concentrations of one or more of oil and gas production, or refineries and petrochemicals and plastics production, or biofuels production. So, for example, the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast, with a high concentration in the Cancer Alley region of Louisiana, which is, as we know, one of the most severely polluted places in the world. Also, the Ohio River Valley and Appalachia, Ohio, West Virginia, which is also becoming a plastics and petrochemicals hub. New Mexico, the upper Midwest, where there's a lot of corn ethanol and other biofuels production. And Kern County, California, which is the biggest oil and gas producing region there, etc. So those are the predictable places, and that's where a lot of this is happening.
Thank you, Basaf. It's really unfortunate that the people who are already overburdened with this infrastructure for plastics, petrochemicals, and fossil fuels are the ones who are experiencing a lot of this. And it's just really hard to take in general. I appreciate you raising these concerns. Pam, one last question for you. You talked a little bit about the primacy applications going to states to give states authority over Class 6 injection wells. And are there, and you spoke to some of the issues, that you are seeing in Illinois, but are there things that should be considered specifically when we think about transferring primacy over to states that should be considered that are unique?
So I don't think my answer is going to be unique to Illinois, but I will say what we've experienced in Illinois is probably what is being experienced in other states. I'll start out by saying I think some of the largest concerns, and I think I said this during the slide presentation, have to do not only with the state's capacity to implement the program, but also with the pressures they are likely to receive from industry. And I think those concerns then translate into the state's ability and their willingness to carry out oversight. Um, Industry has lobbied really hard here in Illinois to stop all three regulatory CCS bills that we've put forward, two of which we were successfully able to get adopted. They claim, and I'm sure they do this across the country, that regulations are going to stop economic development. They're going to cost jobs. And the regulations are overly burdensome. Just leave it to them. Everything will be fine. I have real concerns that the CCS industry will push states with primacy, to weaken their standards, to fast track those projects, and to reduce oversight from the federal process, which, we heard today is already demonstrated to be problematic. But the underlying question is why? We just saw Indiana just approve their application for primacy, right? The states respond positively to the promises of economic development and jobs. We hear that every single time we try to put something forward that would regulate this industry. Illinois, with its stringent CCS bill, is no exception. I can't tell you how many times we hear this, and a lot of legislators listen. But I also think companies are eager to take advantage of those 45Q tax incentives. So what have we learned here? That might be applied elsewhere. We're fortunate. I'm fortunate to live in a state where we were able to get regulations passed, and I recognize others are not so fortunate. But I think if we all keep our heads and minds open to the underlying issues that are before us, and that is public health and safety, the protection of our water, and certainly our environmental justice communities, et cetera, then hopefully some of these underlying objectives that I just talked about won't be at the forefront of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Pam. And I think that your comments really highlight the importance of really having federal regulatory floors that protect basic human rights to clean water and clean air, and don't leave things up to states to do those. And if states want to take more protective measures to protect their residents beyond federal standards because of unique issues or concerns that those states have, they should be able to do that. But right now, what we really have is an industry that was built on pilot projects that is now expanding rapidly despite the failures of those pilot projects, and is now putting communities across the country at risk and costing taxpayers billions of dollars. And with that, I will wish everyone well and appreciate everyone taking the time to join us for this briefing today, engage in this issue. And thank you again to all of our speakers for being here. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Take care.